this sprung out in an organic way. A number of us in various fringe fields like creativity and spontaneous thought in my case, and mind wandering. We're trying to figure out, can we bring together a forum of people where we could have, some discussions, some synergy. And this is the first one. And you might think, and I've heard this as well, lots of us are not just involved in fringe topics, but we're also interested in all kinds of creative things. And in general, people who work on these topics and who have these tendencies tend to be really bad organization. So the fact that we're here today is a miracle. And we're extremely lucky to have Schacter today with us, who is also very interested in these topics, and he needs no introduction. But I'm a great fan of him. He's been amazing at bringing together not just the breadth of issues, but also exploring them in extreme depth. And what I'm really excited is about the fact that he tends to be excited about topics that I'm excited about. And you'll hear a lot about that in terms of episodic memory simulations, imagination, all of these super cool things that we're excited about as well. Please welcome that Schacter.
Thanks, Kalina. I'm pleased to be able to speak at first meeting. Second meeting. That's right. I saw that on the website about this group. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. Also for not scheduling this on Wednesday morning. I don't think I could have gotten out of bed to get this. But I'm recovering. Oh, you're from Ohio. Okay. So my talk today is going to really focus on a concept that I think is very well known to just about everybody here, and that's the concept of episodic memory. And even just grabbing a definition from Wikipedia, I think we get a pretty good one that we can all nod our heads about that captures the essence of what Tolving had in mind in 1972 when he distinguished episodic from semantic memory. Memory of autobiographical events, times, places, associated emotions, and other contextual who, what, when, where, why knowledge that can be explicitly stated, collection of past personal experiences that occurred at a particular time and place. And episodic memory has been studied in great detail for many decades now. The main point of my talk today is really very simple, and it can be captured in a single sentence. So if you don't remember anything else I talk about today, the point I'm going to drive home from a few different perspectives is that episodic memory isn't just about remembering. That's mostly how it's characterized and mostly how it's been studied, but there's more to it than that. It turns up in other contexts that are of great interest, I think, to this group. Plays, I think, an interesting role in imagination and creativity, and that's kind of what has pulled me into this area. And so I want to look at that in three ways in today's talk. One, begin by talking about a recent wave of research on remembering the past and imagining the future, and introduce the concept of constructive episodic simulation that my group has worked with. Second, I'm going to talk a little bit about episodic specificity and how that relates to future imagining and a form of problem solving. And then I'll wrap up by talking about divergent creative thinking and episodic contributions to such. Okay. Over the last decade or so, some of you, or many of you, may be aware that there's been a really rapidly growing area of research that is based on the fundamental observation that when people remember past experiences, it looks a lot at the brain and cognitive levels like when they imagine future experiences. There's a neuron review that, not quite up to date now, but captures a lot of what's going on in this field that I wrote with a bunch of other people who have been active in the area. And I just pulled 3 illustrations from that review and others. So we know, for example, that amnesic patients with medial temporal lobe damage, they're virtually defined by severe episodic memory deficits. Many of them also have difficulties imagining personal futures or novel scenes. Not every amnesic, but I would say, as the literature has unfolded, most of them do have this problem. Related observation from studies of aging and psychopathology, we know that older adults, Alzheimer patients, depressed individuals, schizophrenics, patients with PTSD, when you ask them to remember their past experiences, they tend to remember those with less episodic details, specifics about what happened, where it happened, than corresponding controls. And what more recent studies have shown is that exactly the same reduction in episodic detail occurs when they project into the future. They imagine their future experiences with the similar kind of reduction in episodic detail, who, what, where, when, that is observed when they remember the past. And then finally, neuroimaging studies, another kind of evidence that has shown that many of the same brain regions are active when people are put in the scanner and asked to remember a past experience or imagine a future experience. So in my lab, our first study on this was one led by Donna Addis, published almost a decade ago now. People were put in the scanner. They were given cue words, asked in one condition to remember, try to remember while being scanned, a particular experience that occurred in a particular time period, let's say the past year, related to the cue word. In another condition, that's the past condition, imagine a future experience that might occur to them, let's say in the next year, that is related to whatever keyword we happen to be giving. And then activity in those conditions is compared to control conditions where people are given the same cue word and they carry out semantic and visual spatial processing tasks that do not involve remembering or imagining a personal episode. As you can see, particularly with the midline regions, the posterior cingulate, medial parietal, medial prefrontal, it's really a striking similarity observed between remembering the past and imagining the future. And there were other regions that showed that same pattern, so much so that in a Nature Reviews paper with Addis and Randy Buckner we wrote around that time, we suggested, based on our study, another similar study from Carl Spooner and Kathleen McDermott, and an earlier PET study by Okuda and colleagues, that remembering past events, imagining future events, and perhaps related kinds of mental simulations were all supported by what we refer to as a core network, prominently comprised of those midline regions we just saw, and also lateral parietal, lateral temporal, and medial temporal regions that we saw commonly come online for remembering the past and imagining the future. In the previous study, I didn't show them on the slide. And of course, many of you will immediately see that that core network overlaps very substantially with the well-known default mode network, and we'll come back to say something about that later. We put that forth based on just a few studies, but in a more recent meta-analysis led by Roland Benoit, who was a postdoc in my lab, now has moved on to run his own lab at a Max Planck in Leipzig, we were able to basically confirm the early suggestions from our 2007 paper on a much bigger sample, as research in this area has really taken off over the last decade. But I think that these common involvement in core network regions and remembering the past and imagining the future holds over a much broader range of studies. And of course, there are also important differences. I don't want to ignore those, but this is really what drew us into thinking about what do remembering and imagining have in common. Well, linking some of these observations to the research on constructive memory, which is something I've been interested in for a long time, a couple of other 2007 papers, Donna Addis and I put forth what we call the constructive episodic simulation hypothesis. And that is the idea that episodic memory plays a key role in imagining future scenarios. We often refer to that as episodic simulation. And it does so by supporting the ability to flexibly retrieve and recombine elements of stored episodes to construct possible future episodes. So the idea is that episodic memory is well suited to supporting our ability to project into the future because the system provides flexible access to past experiences and allows us to kind of take bits and pieces of one, combine them in a new way with another, project into the future to try to imagine, anticipate, plan for a new scene. The future is rarely an exact replica of the past, So we're going to use memory to support future simulation. We need a flexible system that allows us to recombine bits and pieces of past experience. So episodic memory does a good job at that from our perspective. But this flexible retrieval and recombination, which is adaptive when we're attempting to use memory for purposes of future simulation, we also hypothesized, and this is the link to the constructive memory literature, could result in memory errors when elements of past experience are miscombined. So the very same flexibility that makes the memory system good for supporting future simulation, and we see that as a key, if not the key function of episodic memory, making available information about the past to think about different ways in which the future can play out, might also produce some of the memory errors that we as memory researchers are very familiar with. I won't have time to unpack this any further today, but if you're interested, there's a paper coming out in JP Learning Memory Cognition, led by a graduate student in the lab, Alexis Carpenter, that provides what I think is some pretty neat evidence on this point, experimental evidence linking flexible retrieval and flexible recombination processes with memory errors. Okay, now from this perspective, we're saying that episodic memory, a big job for episodic memory is to support future simulation. And we're holding that it's highly adaptive, in fact, sufficiently beneficial that it's worth the resulting cost of memory errors to set up the system this way. So it's really important from this perspective that future simulation, episodic simulation, actually buys you something. Because why would you set up a system that is flawed, has some cost associated with it that we think at least are associated with the benefits of using it to think about the future? Using episodic memory to think about the future isn't all that helpful to begin with. That wouldn't make any sense. And in fact, some have questioned the utility of episodic simulation as an adaptive process. So Gilbert and Wilson, in their very nice science paper in 2007, pulled together a lot of evidence from the affective forecasting literature. People are sometimes inaccurate in projecting ahead and predicting their future happiness, and they attributed some of those errors to limitations on episodic simulations that they spelled out in their article. David Dunning has made the same point about some errors in planning, such as the planning fallacy, where we don't allow enough time to carry out a future task. He says, well, you know, part of the reason that occurs is because our episodic simulations don't contain all the relevant information. It's also the case, and many people here know this, that the core network supporting episodic simulation, of course, overlapping substantially, being pretty much the same thing as the default network, well, that's been characterized as a task-negative brain network. It's not a network that, at least at one time, some people thought could be counted on to support functionally useful activity. So we know that default network was initially identified in the classic studies from the late 90s and early 2000s, Retrieval, and others, from meta-analyses that were looking for brain regions that were more active during passive rest states than active task states. And lo and behold, those default network regions come online. There are various reviews on this topic that those of you who aren't familiar with it might find interesting. And of course, there's also activity in default network regions has been linked to task negative, if you will, activities such as mind wandering, which I know is of interest in this group. So Mason et al. In their science paper 2007 showed activity in default network regions that came online more so in the low versus high demand working memory task, which also produces increased mind wandering. You have a low demand of the main task that allows people to mind wander a little bit more, and then you see default network regions come online. And we know that mind wandering can impair memory and learning. So it impairs working memory performance, not shockingly, if you mind wander during the task. Reading comprehension can suffer if you mind wander away from the text. And we've done some work in my lab, led by Carl Spooner, showing that there's impaired learning from lectures. When you mind wander during the lecture, that's not a good thing for subsequent lecture learning. We all kind of know that from our students in our classes, but not here. However, we've seen during the last few years from a variety of sources of evidence that the idea that the default network basically is a task-negative network and it just supports task-irrelevant activities that don't do much of anything for you is not correct. So in my lab, Nathan Sprang led a series of studies that showed that the default network becomes active during a complex autobiographical planning task. That there's a lot more to this task than the standard imagine what you might do next week task that we had others and used in previous studies. So you're given in Nathan's task a goal such as academic success, saving money. You have a few elements that you have to link, integrate into a plan, obstacles you've got to overcome, and you've got to do this while you're in the scanner. And when performing this more goal-directed autobiographical task, indeed the increases in default network activity are seen compared to a control task. And importantly, and this is held up over several subsequent studies after an initial study in 2010, connectivity analyses showed that the default network coupled with a distinct executive network, known as the frontal-parietal control network, during autobiographical planning. So this is an important observation that the default network is not just sort of floating out there on its own. It can couple its activity with executive regions and drive goal-directed performance. And indeed, this is a point that was made by Kalina in a paper published the year before regarding mind wandering. In their study, when people mind wandered, they saw default network activity, and they saw this same sort of coupling phenomenon, and made, I think, the important point that although, when you mind wander during a task, it might undermine immediate goals. Mind wandering may also enable the parallel operation of diverse brain areas in the service of distal goals. So you're losing out on the working memory task, maybe you're coming with a new idea for your experiment, something along those lines. So these observations all fit very nicely and underscore that the default network should not be just thought of as some task-negative network. Now, there's more direct evidence on the adaptive functions of episodic simulation. I could spend the rest of the talk on this, but I won't. I'll refer you to a 2012 American Psychologist paper for a detailed review, but there's evidence concerning episodic simulation boosting planning and problem solving, psychological well-being and empathy, and far-sighted decision-making in temporal discounting paradigms. I will touch a little bit on these in the course of going into some of the work from my lab. But again, in answer to the initial concern or question, here we're claiming that episodic memory is set up to support future imagining, that we may pay a price for that with some memory errors, but is it a functionally useful thing that the system has been set up to support? And I think the answer to that question is yes, based on the current literature. Okay, well, if it is yes, then it makes sense to start asking questions about how we might enhance the contributions of episodic simulation and retrieval to various tasks. And so what I want to do now is switch over and tell you about a series of studies that we've been doing in the lab over the past few years that's been focused on this question. Is going to get us further into the domain of imagination, a little on problem solving, and eventually to divergent creative thinking. So let's talk about episodic specificity and future imagining and problem solving. Our approach to this issue of enhancing the contributions of episodic retrieval and simulation involves the use of an episodic specificity induction. What is that? Well, it's basically brief training in recollecting details of a past experience. So the idea is we're going to give you a little practice in recollecting in detail a recent experience, and then we're going to look for downstream consequences of having done that. How that brief retrieval practice and recollecting details of a recent experience may impact your ability to perform tasks later on that we think draw on episodic memory. So it's like cranking up or priming, if you will, specific episodic retrieval processes. The particular technique that we use for this induction is known as the cognitive interview. It was developed by Fisher and Geiselman almost 25 years ago now at UCLA, and it's mainly been used as a forensic protocol that has been shown in some studies to increase accurate episodic retrieval eyewitnesses. So in eyewitness testimony, it's long been an issue. How do you maximize accurate retrieval, pull as much as you can out of an eyewitness's memory without being suggestive and creating false memories? And so the cognitive interview is used for that purpose. We adapted that to be kind of our induction tool in this series of experiments. And then the logic here is that the specificity induction should enhance performance downstream on later tasks that draw on episodic memory, and those could be memory tasks, simulation, imagination tasks, but critically, while having no effect on tasks that reverse. I haven't really a better one. I think the one up here is dead.
You get that.
Thanks. There you go. Wow, that's great. Well, so the logic is that this induction is going to enhance downstream performance on tasks that draw on episodic memory, benefit from cranking up those detailed episodic retrieval processes while having no effect on subsequent tasks that don't draw on episodic memory. So our first paper on this was published a couple of years ago. These experiments were led by Kevin Medor, a graduate student in the lab who is still doing a lot with this particular procedure. And let's run through the basic method. So in this experiment, there were 24 young and 24 older adults. We have the older adults in here because there's a separate background logic for these experiments that I won't have time to go into that came out of prior aging studies in our lab, aging and future simulation studies that actually led to this approach. But that's the reason why this study also had older adults in it, but it's not central to our concerns today. So 24 young, 24 healthy older adults, they come in for 2 sessions spaced a week apart, and they do the same thing or run through the same sort of thing in each of the 2 sessions. First, they view a short video. It's just of people doing stuff in a kitchen, routine actions in a kitchen. It could be potentially anything, but we had this video lying around the lab from years past, and we used it for this purpose. Then they get an induction, either the specificity induction, the cognitive interview, I'll take you through that in more detail in a minute, or control induction that I'll describe later. And then after that's done, they go on to do ostensibly unrelated tasks, where they see a picture cue, and in the memory condition, they're asked to remember a related experience from the past year that the picture reminds them of. In the imagination condition, they're asked to imagine a future experience that is in some way related to the picture that could plausibly occur to them. And in the description task, they're asked to just describe what's in the picture. Okay? Session 2, they come back, they see another version of the video, they get whichever induction they didn't get the week before that had specificity, now control, and vice versa, and they run through another series of memory, imagination, and description tasks. So this is what the inductions look like. Again, it's a specificity induction based on the cognitive interview. There are various probes about details of mental imagery. Tell me more about what happened, what was the order in which things happened, and others. So this would be the sort of typical extract from the interview. I want you to close your eyes and get a picture in your head about the people in the video you saw. I want you to think about what they look like, what they were wearing. Once you have a really good picture, I want you to tell me everything you remember about the people in the video. Try to be as specific and detailed as you can. And we use various control inductions, but this is the main one that I'll be focusing on today because there have never been any big differences between the various control inductions that we've used. But here we call this the impressions control. You're also thinking back to the video that you just saw, but now instead of unpacking specific episodic detail, you're giving your general impressions. What were your impressions of the people in the video? Did you like it? When did you think it was made? How well did you think it was made? Those things. They go on for the same amount of time in both conditions, so in both cases they're thinking back. Only here is detailed episodic retrieval involved. And so this just shows you examples of the pictures. They're shown one by one. So, you know, if you've shown this picture in the memory condition, you might remember your trip to Cape Cod last summer and unpack that for 3 minutes as much detail as you can. We see that as an episodic dependent task. In the imagine condition, if I show you this one, shopping mall. You might imagine going to your local shopping mall in a couple of months and unpack that for 3 minutes. We see that as episodic dependent. And then finally, in the described condition, you just describe what's going on in front of you. Describe in as much detail as you can what's in the picture. We see that as episodic independent. That shouldn't bring episodic memory online, therefore it shouldn't be affected by the specificity induction, whereas the other two should. Now the coding here is very important. Some of you may be familiar with the autobiographical interview developed by Brian Levine and colleagues, and that's what we use to code these protocols. You get 3 minutes worth of a lot of details. And the autobiographical interview breaks these details into two basic kinds, internal and external. Internal details are basically episodic details. So first let's look at the memory imagination task. Who was there, what happened, where did it happen, when it happened. Those would be coded as internal details, episodic details. External details are a little bit of a mixture of a few things. We could think of them as broadly reflecting semantic information and some other things as well, but commentary, inferences, related semantic information. So this is the core of what happened in the episode. This is kind of related information, reflections about the meaning of what happened and so forth. And then in picture description, an internal detail is coded as a detail that is in the picture that you can see. And external is the same. It might be your reflection on, something that you think might happen to that person or what they're thinking. Those would be external details. Okay, so it's critical that blind raters agree as to what's an internal and external detail, critical to this whole procedure, and we've never had any problems with that. We get very high agreement between blind raters who score at least a subset of the protocol. So then let's look at the results. So the first thing you'll notice, we're focusing on internal details. Older adults overall produce fewer on all three tasks of these internal details than the younger adults. That replicates our previous finding. But the critical observation here is that after just having had the specificity induction, both young adults, blue bars, and older adults, blue bars, come up with more internal details during memory and imagination than after they just had the control induction, gray bars. So older adults are down overall, but they boost just as much as younger adults, and we're taking that boost as a sign of the impact of episodic memory retrieval on the memory task and on the imagination task. And critically, there's no impact on the description task in either the young or older adults, at very high levels in the young, lower levels in the old. So it's not just that you produce more stuff or you talk more after you've had the specificity induction, because that would show up in the description task, but it doesn't. It's only impacting the memory and imagination task, the episodic dependent task. And similarly, external details, there's no impact of the induction at all on these details. So it's really selectively targeting the internal details for memory and imagination. It's not just boosting your tendency to talk more or anything like that. So the conclusion is that the induction dissociates retrieval of episodic details during remembering and imagining from both semantic retrieval to the extent that that's reflected by external details and what we might think of as non-episodic narrative processes, just the way you talk about experiences, which, for example, may be different in older adults, and that would be tapped by picture description, but it's having no impact on that because it's really targeting episodic detail retrieval. And the implication then is that we can use this induction to try to identify and enhance the contribution of episodic retrieval and simulation to various kinds of tasks that might draw on episodic memory, even though we wouldn't think of them as episodic memory tasks. Here's a way to probe for an impact of episodic memory on tasks that would tap imagination, creativity, and so on. Okay, so let me give you one further example from the imagination domain, some recent work on how people address worrisome future experiences, things they're really worried about. We know that worry about the future can be very disruptive to psychological functioning. That's no surprise. There is some evidence out there that when people imagine a worrisome future event, it can be beneficial for emotion regulation to the extent that they can imagine the event with a lot of detail and imagine kind of a positive outcome to that event. That's some early work by Brown et al. On women imagining going to the hospital for a first-time pregnancy. If they can imagine the event with a lot of detail, imagine a positive outcome, they feel better, less worried going to the hospital. So in a recent paper led by Helen Jing, graduates did in the lab, we're able to manipulate simulation detail with the specificity induction and look at its effect on things that students are, in this case, are worried about. We predicted a beneficial effect on a few outcome measures related to future worry. So they come in to the lab. These are all mostly Harvard undergraduates. They come in for a first session. They list 30 specific concrete problems that they're worried about. I'm worried about doing poorly on the final for my psychology class because that would bring down my GPA. Turns out Harvard undergraduates are really worried about a lot of things. If you want easy material to work with, just come to our department and start asking them because they're worried. What is the positive outcome, we ask them, that you hope for will happen for this event? I get an A on the final. What is the negative outcome you fear will happen? I fail the final, brings down my grade in class. Then they come back later for sessions 2 and 3 after we've got those worrisome events, and the setup is pretty much the same as in the previous study that I told you about. You're going to see those videos, get either specificity or control induction, and you're going to get a version of a problem solving and a reappraisal test that I'll tell you about in a minute as the main outcome measures, and these two things are spread a week apart. So in sessions 2 and 3, the problem solving test is a variant of, we call it a personal means and problem solving test based on some older work by Platt and Spivak that we'd actually used in another paper I don't have time to get into today. So there's 6 personal problem stories, and you have 5 minutes for each of these to generate steps to reach a personal outcome. These are all based on the worrisome events that they gave us in the first session. And they're set up in a particular format that reflects what Platt and Spivak did in the means and problem solving test. So you'd like to do well on your upcoming psychology final. The story begins with you worrying about your psychology final. It ends with you getting an A on the final. Please fill in the middle of the story. And so you've got a beginning point. Here's a solution. How do you get from point A to point B? And then you code the data that they give you into what are called relevant steps. Those are steps that move the person toward the goal, and irrelevant or other steps. And these are things that don't help you to achieve the goal. And again, we have high integrator reliability about what's a relevant versus irrelevant or other step. And this is basically the main result is pretty much as you've seen before. If you just had a specificity induction, you get a boost in the number of relevant steps that you provide when you're trying to figure out how to constructively deal with this worrisome future event compared to control. Once again, it's not just heightening verbal output. Actually, they come up with a few less other or irrelevant steps after having had the induction. The other task that we used here, we call it an episodic reappraisal task. That's adapted some of the work of James Gross and his colleagues on reappraisal and motion regulation. So you've got 6 bad outcome scenarios. Again, things they said they feared would happen in the initial session. You have 5 minutes to reframe that. So please imagine a scenario in which you just found out you did very poorly on your psych final exam. Now imagine and tell a story how you're able to reinterpret and reframe the situation so that it feels less negative to you, coded into internal and external details as before with high agreement. And we pretty much see the same pattern as you're now used to. You just have a specificity induction. When you're trying to reframe this worrisome event, you do so with more internal detail than after you've just had the control induction, and again, no effect or going the other way for external detail, so it's not just a boost in verbal outcome. They also showed pre-post increases on several measures of subjective well-being. They felt better as a consequence of having come up with these better ways of constructively dealing with their problems after having had the specificity induction versus control. Okay, so those results clearly support the idea that episodic retrieval is contributing 2, autobiographical memory, future imagining, means of problem solving, reappraisal. And in kind of a review, a theoretical paper on this that came out in a special issue of the journal, interdisciplinary journal Memory Studies on remembering the past and imagining the future that I helped to edit. We suggested that what's going on here is that the induction is biasing kind of the retrieval orientation of the subject, so they're more focused on episodic details related to people, places, and actions that comprise an event. And this increased focus is then going to impact performance on downstream tasks that involve constructing a mental event or constructing a scene. You're now focused more on the episodic details related to that event or scene. And that characterization led us to some predictions regarding brain regions targeted by the specificity induction. So we predicted that activity in core network regions that had been previously linked with episodic detail, most notably the hippocampus and inferior parietal lobe, would be influenced during a future imagining task preceded by a specificity induction as compared to a control induction. And I'm not going to have time to go through all the details and all the results of this study. It just came out in PNAS I guess about a month or two ago. And it's basically taking the basic future imagining task that we used years ago now in the original ADDIS study and one of the controls tasks from that study, where you're using single cues. You're either imagining a personal event or in response to that cue, or you're generating what we call a side sentence, including the cue word and two related words. That's something we found to be a good control task in previous studies. And critically, you get these tasks following either a specificity induction or a control induction, counterbalanced all one session in the scanner. If you look at activity for imagine greater than object, separately for specificity and control, you get the typically robust core network, default network findings that we always get. This is very reliable stuff. The critical question comes from comparing the specificity and control inductions, and there indeed what we see is that after the specificity induction, the two predicted regions, the hippocampus, left anterior, and also the inferior parietal lobule are coming on more strongly after you've had specificity versus control. The precuneus behaves the same way. And there's some other interesting findings in this experiment regarding connectivity, functional connectivity changes as a function of the induction that I won't have time to unpack now. Okay, so I've just got a few minutes left. Let me devote my remaining couple of minutes to episodic contributions to divergent creative thinking, where we're going to sort of play roughly the same game and see how it impacts measures of creativity. Now, there are several lines of evidence out there suggesting that episodic memory and simulation may contribute to divergent thinking, which, as you all know, was defined by Guilford almost 50 years ago now, as the ability to generate creative ideas by combining diverse kinds of information in novel ways. Sort of sounds like episodic simulation. Okay, let's run through a few of these clues. One was a study from my lab led by Donna Addis. It was actually we threw in as a sort of extra measure in a study we conducted years ago on future imagining the alternate uses task, which, as many of you will know, is a standard test of divergent thinking, where you're given the name of an object and you've got to generate unusual uses for that object. And then took a while to get around to analyzing those data, but interestingly, as reported in paper memory, the finding here was that the number of episodic details in people's future simulations, how many internal details they provided when they simulated a future event, was positively correlated with generation of appropriate uses in the AUT that's missing there. It's been shown that amnesic patients, who of course have very significant deficits in episodic memory, perform poorly on divergent thinking tasks. Duff et al. Showed that a couple of years ago. There have been reports that people in using protocol studies that Gilhooly and colleagues showed that occasionally episodic memories are reported on the alternate uses task. They'll say, oh, I remember something. Somebody did something unusual with a brick, for example. And there's been evidence of activation in the medial temporal lobe and other default network regions during the AUT. Benedict and colleagues in a neuroimage paper 2014 and related creative generation tests from Elmo et al. 2012. And interestingly, we talked earlier about the default executive coupling seen during autobiographical planning and even mind wanting. This has now been observed in several studies of creative thinking. For those of you who want a review of that, Roger Beatty, who's here at the meeting and is now a postdoc in my lab, led a sort of review paper. We brought together a bunch of evidence on exactly that point and some of the points regarding episodic memory that I'm talking about today. That's out a few months in ticks. Okay, so put all that together, and there's at least suggestive evidence that episodic memory contributes to divergent creative thinking. Well, that, of course, then is a setup for the specificity induction approach. There's suggestive evidence out there. Well, our first thought, of course, is that means that the specificity induction should impact divergent creative thinking. So we looked at that by giving the specificity induction or control, following it up with the alternate uses task, the AUT, and a control object association task where subjects are given an object name, but instead of coming up with unusual uses, they just come up with familiar associates to the object. Doesn't require much in the way of divergent thinking. This was reported in Psych Science last year. Setup you become familiar with. The video, you get one induction or the other. We throw in the imagination task. I'm not going to report that, just as a manipulation check to make sure it's all replicating and it replicates. And then we're interested in the alternative uses and objects data. And these are the critical results. There's a lot that one could say about scoring the AUT. I'm showing you results here from, I guess, the standard measure that people would refer to of flexibility, appropriate uses, or categories of appropriate uses that people come up with. And after the induction, they're coming up with more appropriate uses, a few more, than after the control. And again, it's selective. It's not impacting that object association task. There are other measures of the AUT that you can look at. You'll get this same result for all of the generative outputs. There are a few more novel items that they come up with. If you look at like rated originality, they're not rated as any more original, they're just more of them. And we replicated that in a second experiment where we asked whether the effect extends to convergent thinking as assessed by the remote associates task of Mednick from 1962, and the answer is no. We replicated the effect on divergent thinking, didn't see any effect on convergent thinking. So again, it is selective. And this is just another paper that shows that we extended this finding to older adults, just came out in Memory and Cognition, and another divergent thinking task that involves generating consequences of unusual or novel scenarios, get the same boost from the specificity induction. Then the last thing I want to mention very briefly is that we've seen throughout this talk now that remembering past experiences, imagining the future, and divergent creative thinking, they're all affected in pretty much the same way, at least by the episodic specificity induction. You might think they would share neural substrates, but we don't have it within within experiment comparison for all three. So Roger Beatty has conducted such an experiment with some collaboration from us and Matthias Benedict. So there's a direct comparison involving using common objects as cue words and asking participants to remember a related past experience, imagine a future experience, create new and unusual uses on an AUT type task, and this is the control task. There are lots of interesting results in this experiment. Basically, I just want to show you the conjunction analysis that shows that in addition to some between task differences that were observed, both with connectivity and just straight up univariate activation analysis, the conjunction analysis does reveal common activity relative to baseline in a couple of the key default network regions. So there's some take-home messages, episodic simulation and the default network that it supports, certain adaptive function. We've seen that the specificity induction can enhance and identify contributions of episodic retrieval and simulation. And we talked about initial fMRI evidence indicating that default network regions are recruited during future imagining after the specificity induction. And what we're doing now actually is looking to see whether that effect takes the same form when you do the induction with, for example, a divergent creative thinking task. So thanks to my lab members, collaborators, funding sources, and thanks for your attention.
Very, very much.
Okay.
It's always, I think it's always good to get a divergence